Okay, so welcome everyone. I believe this is now, I think, our 9th discussion forum webinar based on our Delta Think News and Views series. So for those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. We're happy to see you again. And those who are new, we're glad to have you join us today. First, let me start off with a few introductions. I'm Lori Carlin, Chief Commercial Officer here at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating the session for us today. With me are my colleagues, Heather Staines, strategy consultant here at Delta Think and Director of Community Engagement for our OA data and analytics tool, and Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer, and along with Ann Michael, an architect of the OA data and analytics tool. If you've joined us for a News and Views forum before, then you know we've designed these to be very interactive. Lots of questions and participation from you all. So I hope you're ready for a lively and informal discussion and ready to ask your questions. A few logistical items before we begin. When you have a question, if you can ask it in the Q&A box, that would be great. As far as structure, we'll have some opening remarks from Dan and Heather to start us off with. And then we'll move into questions and open discussion after that. And this is meant to be informal. And with that, even though we've scheduled an hour for this session, it really depends on how many questions there are, how long the discussion goes. It won't be more than an hour. I don't want to scare you, but it could be less than an hour. We'll just see how the discussion unfolds. So thank you again for joining us, and I will hand off to Heather now, and she can get us started.
Thanks so much, Lori. It's great to be here again with everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us today or to view this recording later. This is our annual APC price update webinar, which refers back to the News and Views released earlier in March. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that process, about the same time every year, we go through and we gather journal information on all journals for the large and significant publishers, whether they are OA or whether they are subscription. Then we look at those numbers that are fully OA, and we see how they stack up to the numbers for hybrid, as well as journals that have no OA option. So the basic information includes journal APCs. Again, we do this at the same time every year, even though those prices might be updated at many different times throughout the year, depending on a publisher, because we want to get a comparable snapshot and make sure that we capture trends in a consistent manner. It's a lot of work for Dan to undertake, looking at these lists. For those of you who've tried, every publisher uses a different format. And we're hoping that the process that we go through will save you a lot of work. We now have about 100,000 data points, about 20 across 20,000 journals, and we go back 7 years. So the sample currently covers about 2 million published articles, or about 70% of the overall output as we estimate it. And with that, I'll hand over to Dan in case there's anything I missed about the data process, and then he's going to kick us off with what we've learned for this year.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So yes, thanks for that introduction, Heather. And I have the enviable task now of presenting the slides and the numbers to you. So this first chart here really just tries to summarize this year's prices. For the subscribers to our tool, you can see all the labels on the axes and all the detail. For the purposes of this webinar, we wanted to keep it fairly simple. So the point is that if you look at the APCs, count up the number of journals that have APCs that fall into different bands. So each bar on the chart represents a band of $500, $0 to $500 on the far left, $500 to $1,000, and so on. You can then see the most popular price points, and that's really what this chart is showing, classic histogram. And really the pricing is highly consolidated. It's $3,000 to $3,500 seems to be the most popular APC chosen by publishers. The colors, the stripiness in the bars, there's one color per publisher in our sample. Again, we won't delude you with all that kind of visual noise on the slide. And again, if subscribers to our tool can pull all that apart and filter out by different publishers and so on. But this chart is really just aimed at showing you that there's a real kind of consolidation to pricing, real popular price point there in the middle. And then the price has gone less and less popular as you move further away from that. And then finally, you'll notice there's a really thin bit on the right-hand side. You can barely see that. I think if I just waggle that little dot over it, that bit on the very far right-hand side just represents really entrance to the market last year. When last year we saw that a number of very high impact journals like the Nature family of journals and many of the Cell journals started to offer APCs. They started to offer an open access option for the first time, and they priced themselves accordingly right towards that high end. So it's those few journals that represent those really small bars at the right hand side. But that last year was a bit of an exception. This year things are sort of fallen back a bit more to average in terms of price increases, new entrants. We'll come on to that a bit. But just to give you a sense of where things lie, the highest prices for a fully open access journal this year has gone up from $5,560 to $8,900. So quite a big leap at the very top end of the fully open journals. I think that was down to one Cell title, and there's maybe a second one coming along at a similar price point after an introductory period expires. So the fully open side of things, that has seen a bit of a leap at the very high end. In terms of the hybrid journals, the highest hybrid journal is $11,390. That's the highest price you're likely to pay for a hybrid APC. But to bring this sort of more to the averages, typically the higher end of hybrid is around $5,500, $5,500. That tends to represent the kind of upper end, and then you've got these very, very few sort of ultra high impact journals above that. So that just gives you a sense of where things are falling. Other than that, the other big pattern of the thing this chart doesn't show, but again, we can filter for in our tool, is the kind of difference in average between a fully open journal and a hybrid journal. Basically, fully open journals tend to charge less than their hybrid cousins, approximately 60%, 59–60% is the difference. So for a fully open journal, on average, you'll pay about 60% of the average APC for a hybrid journal. So I think that covers off most of the headlines on the price bands. Heather, I don't know if you want to come in with anything else there.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction on how the pricing bands work. And I'll say it's definitely a lot of work. So Dan, goes deep cover for a time when he's working on this. So now that we've looked at how those pricing bands are represented there in the histogram, how does this year compare to last year?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we have seen this year that prices have continued to increase. Last year, as I said, we had these new journals, these high impact journals coming on stream for the first time, and they were pricing at the high end of the market. So what we found last year was that there were very, very large price increases compared with normal. This year, we think things have fallen back to something approaching an average or to a long-term average. So just to put that in perspective, this year we think the average hybrid APC has increased by 3.6%. And so that represents about half the increase we saw last year. Just to that point, things are falling back. And then this year we think the fully open access, the average price increase for a fully open access APC, that's gone up by 4.3%. compared with last year. So again, that's falling back to a similar level of price increase to the year before last. Again, speaking to this sort of falling back to, I think, mid to long-term trends. So average hybrid has gone up by 3.6%. Average fully open APC has gone up by 4.3%. So that's depending on sort of when we did this, I think if as we started this process back at the end of last year, that would have represented above inflation increases. As we come into the current climate, it probably represents pretty good bang for your buck, given where inflation is going in general. I'll let other people comment on that, but just to put those numbers in some context.
Yeah, you had to go there, Dan. So maybe we can zoom out, just a little bit. And, I was going to say, we all thinking when we hear, average prices at the gas pump that, it depends on what you can get local to where you are. So, what do these overall average prices and their changes mean for a particular publisher or a particular library that's trying to get their head around this data?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So, I mean, the average is just that. It's a data point in the middle, and it can be, of course, skewed by weird things happening at either extreme. And we've done quite a bit of work on this, Heather. This originally dates back from about, I think, middle of 2020. We put out quite an in-depth analysis looking into this sort of question, so we can refer people back to that. And that piece, I think, is available on our public website as well as to subscribers. So there's some great detail you can go into. And I could quite happily, as you know, speak about this probably for the next half an hour, which would be rather boring for everyone. But in actual fact, those averages mask quite a lot of nuance. So it really depends what you're paying. So, for example, if your institution tends to be, I don't know, a high output institution and tends to favor publication in, let's suppose, the more expensive journals, you may actually find you're paying quite a lot more if publishers are tending to put those slightly more expensive journals up above the average. Of course, the average is just the average, but some journals may go up more and some journals may go up less, or indeed some journals may go down. So the analysis we've done that says in some extreme cases, you can see the average price point goes up just by the same amount for two publishers, but because their publishing activities are very different, the actual prices that are paid on average, when you take into account exactly which journals are used and how many papers are published in each of those journals, you can find the actual average prices paid per paper can vary quite considerably from the average price increase of the journal. So it's just worth noting that. The short answer, the TLDR, is YMMV. In other words, your mileage may vary. It really will depend, I think, on the publication activity of your institution, or as a publisher, the balance of your journal portfolio and exactly which journals you're putting up or down to arrive at that overall average. And as I said, that can quite significantly alter the money that changes hands when you add it all up.
Mm-hmm. Great. So next, maybe we can do a deep dive into what this means for hybrid APCs.
Absolutely. So if I move on to the next slide here. So we're now getting a little bit more complicated, just to break this complex visual down so you can understand it. What we've done is we've taken that histogram. If you imagine the previous slide, let's go back. So if you imagine drawing a line through the tops of each of the bars, you actually get what data scientists call a density plot. And what we've done here is we've taken a series of those lines, one for each year of our data. So basically, the red line is the most recent. That's basically the shape of the histogram, give or take, for the most recent year. And then as we go back in time, the lines change in color from sort of hotter, redder, through to cooler, greener. So the more green it is, the further back in time it is. And what this chart enables us to do is take a look at how are the patterns in prices changing over time. We've also done another thing in that we took that histogram you saw previously and we filtered it just to show hybrid journals. So a couple of things come out here. First of all, there are so many more hybrid journals in the market compared with fully open ones that you tend to find that the shape of hybrids is pretty similar to the shape of the market overall, just because of sheer weight of numbers. And that's why you'll see a big point in the middle. Again, subscribers to our tool can get all the numbers on the axes. We'll try and keep those numbers away for now, just to keep things as simple as we reasonably can. But essentially what we've seen on time is that the most popular price band it started quite high. So the darkest green lines were starting at the most popular price band, the highest point in the the chart being about $3,000 to $3,500 a year. And a few years ago, that popular price band dropped down by about $500 to $1,000, but we find it come back up this year. So in hybrid, it seems that there was historically maybe some discounting or a slight drop in prices, but that's now been reversed, and we're seeing that popular price point coming out right in the middle of the chart. And then also, if you look to the far right, you'll see the orange and the red lines go a little bit further than everything else, and that's representing those new high impact journals that started offering open access options for the first time last year. So there's sort of 2 years worth of data for those now. And then finally, marked by arrow number 3, the right-hand side of the curve is becoming shallower. So what this is saying is that those mid to high prices seem to be going up, and there's more journals falling in that mid to high pricing bracket. And of course, as we were talking about just before, if your particular publications fall in that little bit of the curve, then the chances are you're likely to be paying higher prices, because there's more of those journals that will be affected by that bit of the pricing curve. Yeah, I hope that covers it and makes sense. If anybody wants me to recap on any of that, please put just an observation question in the Q&A. Happy to go through some of this again, because it is a little bit complicated.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And as for what we're seeing happening there in arrow number 3, that's a point that I'm continually focused on, and I'm hearing information that is indeed happening. And it's I think when I started to explore the tool more in depth when I joined last year, this was one of the key aspects of the trend over time that I was looking at. And you can see consistently from that darker line up through the brighter line that that bump is becoming more pronounced over time. It's less of a shallow dip and now more of an actual bump. So it's certainly an activity that publishers are looking at to figure out which journals they may want to look at.
So that's interesting that you're seeing that in reality. It's always good when the kind of, if you like, the observed reality, the anecdotes and the data match. And I think that's a good point. The usefulness of this sort of analysis, I think, Heather, is exactly as you suggest, that if you're a publisher with a number of different journals, you can then look to sort of how you move the prices around to optimize your revenue. And of course, likewise, if you're buying these things, you can use these sorts of tools to analyze the kind of prices you're being charged as well.
And when I look at parts of the tool or show parts of the tool in demos, there are still publishers that have one price point. They keep it simple. But there, as you know, and as this work attests, there are many publishers that have tens, dozens, maybe hundreds of PCs.
And I think it's one of those things that each publisher will need to work through. That there are in actual fact pros and cons for having fewer price points, not least of which is it makes life a lot easier for both publisher and buyer. You've got fewer variations to manage. There's also subtleties behind the data that we don't capture here, but of course publishers can change their prices depending on the type of publication. They might charge more for a review or a research paper compared with a short form article or a conference proceeding and so on. So there's all sorts of variations I think that people can try. And then the kind of the great pros for having more price points is it does allow for greater pricing optimization and greater flexibility in pricing as well.
Let's move on to what's happening in the gold APCs.
So gold, aka fully open access, quick aside in definition. So I think especially historically, open access advocates would refer to journals that were fully open, only published open access, as gold journals. So we call them fully open access journals. We tend to try and steer clear of the colors just because they're not always self-explanatory to everyone. So gold just stroke fully open access journals, whatever your preference is, that's what we're looking at here. So it's the same rules as the previous chart. The red stuff is the most recent, the outline of the most recent histogram, so they're showing the most recent popular price points. And then as you get darker green, you go back in time. what we've done here is two things. Number one, we've filtered our data for only gold / fully open access journals. And secondly, what we did was switch on a little switch that we can do in our tool to include journals that have no APC specified. So either a 0 or sort of unspecified APC. And that's what you're seeing right at the left-hand edge. Those sort of big spikes on the left-hand edge. That's saying there's actually quite a lot of journals where there is no APC levied, or technically the author's not on the hook to go and source the money. In other words, they're likely to be sponsored journals, aka diamond, aka platinum, those sorts of things. So these are journals that may be offered, if you like, free at the point of use, as it were, in terms of publication charges. So that's what's, if you like, skewing the left-hand side of the chart. And then as you move into the center of it, you can see that going back over time, there were kind of two humps in the chart. There were two popular price points. I'm waggling the little laser pointer over the right-hand one, the more expensive one, and then there was the waggling it over the cheaper one, as you can see. And really what's happened over time is those two lumps are kind of merged together, and we're now seeing really quite a distinct popular price point for fully open access journals. It's lower than hybrid. Remember, we're saying on average, fully open is about 60% of average hybrid, so you will on average pay less. But it does seem that in the fully open access world, prices are consolidating, and I think publishers are beginning to sort of coalesce around a particular price band or spread of price bands, and that's what the distinct single hump in the red line is suggesting. And then again, if you look on the right-hand side of the curve, that right-hand side is flattening and ballooning out a bit, again suggesting that we're getting increasing proportions of journals moving towards higher price bands. For what it's worth, I suspect we'll continue to see that happening. I think that historically fully open journals have probably been underpriced, perhaps because they were the newer journals, perhaps because publishers were discounting them in an introductory way or whatnot. But I think as open access becomes established, and of course publishers realize that they do need to generate revenues to sustain their operations, they might start to seek to continue to increase prices. My hunch is in a few years' time we'll start to see fully open and hybrid journals begin to converge and meet parity. However, at the moment, they're very, very different, and that trend seems to be what's continuing to happen. Like all good predictions, I'm sure it could well be proven wrong.
Yeah, it's
Heather, have you again anything you got to anything you want to add? Based on your...
Thanks for highlighting that, and it brings to mind a News and Views we did a couple months back, where you looked at the quality of OA journals over time, revisited an earlier post. To see how these journals were moving up from one quartile to another, and that could well be another reason behind the kind of right sizing of these gold APCs. So I know that you're usually pretty measured and cautious in your overall conclusions, but what can we draw from all of these data points?
Well, I mean, obviously prices are continuing to rise, and they're rising at this kind of mid-single digit number. As I said, I'll let other bigger brains than mine decide whether that's a high or low number in the current climate. And what we're seeing, I think, it is just a falling back to long-term averages. So as I said, we saw the very high impact journals begin to offer open access options for the first time last year. That inevitably skewed the averages, but now I think things are settling back down to longer term patterns. And again, caution with all these averages, the averages don't reflect what you may actually pay, as we've discussed. So remember, it's actually your particular spread of journals or submission patterns that actually dictate ultimately the kind of amount of money that changes hands. And then, oh, excuse me. One other thing we haven't got onto, and actually I'm just looking at the Q&A, Heather. So there's a question here, thinking of society publishers about Plan S. Will Plan S regulations allow societies to offer their members discounts to their non-member standard open access APC now and going forward? I'll get to that in a minute, but just to get into this sort of notion of big mixed model and non-APC type deals. So what we're looking at here is APCs. These are list APCs that publishers will put on their websites. And so we can compare like for like. We always take those listed APCs before any discounts. So that means member discounts, things like that are excluded. Of course, it's entirely up to a publisher who they offer discounts to. When we then look at these big mixed model deals where publishers and institutions may come together and say, right, we want to combine a subscription element, an open access element, bring things together and maybe charge, say, a fixed fee for a total number of papers submitted. That's it. It's just a flat fee. And then maybe those fees will be capped with sort of incremental increases above them. Maybe not. It will depend on the deal. We think this kind of APC-based study continues to be relevant because quite often those transformative deals, read and publish deals, publish and read deals, whatever you want to call them, they're usually calculated based on some sort of unit pricing. So if a publisher says to an institution, listen, we'll let you publish, I don't know, up to 1,000 papers a year for X amount of money, the chances are that's been based on some sort of averages to get to sort of an average revenue per article published. And of course, if there are caps that are then charged, if they've gone above, then of course those will probably be based on APC amounts, usually with some sort of discounting applied. Secondly, publishers typically discount APCs anyway. It may be to members, it may be as introductory offers. They may just do that for particular deals or particular institutions. So then I think coming on to Plan S, I think it really, my understanding of Plan S is Plan S doesn't actually comment on the specific pricing. I know they've talked about looking at transparency and making sure that it's clear to people how the price is justified. But I think it's ultimately up to the funder and the particular publisher as to where they put that pricing and whether or not they want to bake these sorts of discounts into it. So I think the short answer to that question is that Plan S regulations, if I understand them, do allow publishers to offer discounting, as long as they, of course, tick all the rest of the boxes. Are they making sure the articles are published under the correct license, the right author ownership, and so on and so forth, all of those things that come out of Plan S. So my understanding is, yes, societies are free to discount, and we've actually got these other models that we think can be informed and we can get useful insight into them based on this sort of per APC modeling. So sorry, Heather, a bit of a long waffly conclusion, but I wanted
no, that's okay. It gives me
at least answer that question. Again, interested, Heather, into your thoughts, observations, things that you've come across.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things, and thanks for that question. I'm actually writing an article, why editorial should care about Plan S, which is an update of a session that Dana Compton and I did at ISMTE in the fall last year. So I've been, back in the Plan S thick of it, and my understanding is quite similar, Dan, to what you expressed. I'm interested in how that transparency piece is going to play out, because Plan S has indicated that they want publishers to sign up and be transparent about the proportions of APCs which go to different activities, which we all know is very, very challenging to try to put together. But if you are a publisher on this call and you have actually put information on transparent APC information up, please reach out, because I'd love to take a look at how that's going and how, because I think there's a lot of publishers that are going to try to figure that out, as those Plan S requirements come into place. I know that the American Physiological Society has a read and publish and join model. So, when an institution signs an agreement, the authors at that institution automatically get a 1-year membership to the society. So I think that might be something to take a look at if you're interested. And the other thing that I would say on that is there could be systems challenges. You need to be able to capture that information during the submission process if someone is a member and they're subject to an additional discount. And I've spent a lot of time, looking at workflows around the administration of APCs, both from the library and the publisher standpoint. So it's not so easy. If you have your own platform and you want to build in capturing, an additional discount, you put your tech people on it. But if you're using either a third-party workflow or you're hosted on a publisher that has their own platform, then of course you need to make sure that that's something that they could reflect either in the entry of a code or through some other matching criteria. So I think it's a great question. So I think we're going to hand over to questions from the audience. If I can invite Lori back in to moderate. So please do continue to put things in the Q&A box.
Yes, thanks, Heather and Dan. Great discussion. So we had one question Dan answered already about Plan SN member pricing, and we have another one here. So Dan, we talked about in the 2021 numbers how they were outside of the trends. If you take out that growth from those high impact journals, does the pricing increases look similar in that year as well? Would it go back to trend?
I think the short answer is only a little bit. So it sort of depends where you make that cutoff. The very, very highest, I think you can take them out. It's not going to make any difference because it sort of is one or two journals out of many thousands. But I think quite a few were coming in nearer the higher end, the sort of $5,500 plus. So that would have nudged the average up slightly, I think, as well. But quickly looking, I've got a dashboard that people can't see here. I've actually got the tool open in front of me. Switching off those outliers, however, it doesn't seem to reduce it completely back to zero. So it does seem last year was a year for above average price increases, perhaps across the board, or perhaps we just need to do a little bit more analysis because there actually could be a lot of journals at that kind of mid to high increase. So that bulging of the chart as we looked at in both of those curves, I think that's, as the chart bulges outwards on that right hand side, that's probably also driving the average up with it as well. But of course, once it's bulged out, then the average will sort of fall back as it stays bulged out, if that makes sense. So I think there was a number of ththings feeding into last year as we dive into the data. I hope that answers the question.
One kind of clarification, around that, the way that, the question was posed was around high impact journals. And I think, Dan kind of rightly honed in on the super high APC journals, which are also perceived as high impact. But, one of the really interesting things from my side in playing with the data and, working with our subscribers is, there's a lot of high impact journals or those with perceived high impact that don't, supersize those APCs. And I think there had been some discussion when those high APCs were announced, that maybe that was putting a bar in place or planting a flag, and that there was going to be just a consistent march of APCs, up into that higher realm. And we certainly haven't seen immediate action that looks like that. So, there's, just to clarify, between high impact and high APC journals there.
Yeah. I think you're right, Heather. And it really, pricing, another element of what leads to prices is whoever's setting the price, what's their brand positioning? Some publishers deliberately don't want to move to that really high price band, although they may, if you like, offer the high impact. So it does entirely become their choice. And in actual fact, as we found in our data, there seems to be very, very little relationship between measures of impact and where the prices are set. So kind of, Heather, the flip side to what you're saying is there may be quite a lot of journals that don't have the most spectacular measures of impact, but nonetheless will charge quite high APCs relative to things. And again, that could be a brand perception. Let's say a particular publishing organization or society may consider themselves to be very high quality. They may be regarded as the leading or one of the leading societies in their field. As in pretty well all walks of life, that brand positioning would allow them, I think, to charge higher prices. Probably one other thing on the high impact journals, just was with their and I'm slightly showing my age here, but way back in the early noughties when open access was first taking off, there was a UK government inquiry into all this. It was actually triggered by, I believe, a minister at the time was quite shocked that he couldn't get access to his own PhD paper. And this led to a parliamentary committee asking various questions. One of the things that came out of that was the then chief executive of Nature Publishing Group, Richard Sharkin, who's a very, very eminent publisher, has gone on to great things as well and doing great things at the time. He put into the public domain that if the nature journals as were to move to an open access model, they would have to charge between, I think it was 10 and 30,000 pounds to cover their costs. And that number was always sort of stuck in my mind as that sort of 5-figure APC as being reflective of the kind of costs that go into the high impact journals. So I thought it was interesting last year when these high-end journals started to offer these options that they were charging kind of approaching that. And I've always had the view at some point, you know, what would people pay to get published in a Nature or a Cell or a Lancet, or, you know, other high impact journals are available, of course. You know, is it worth it? And I think to many people, to many funders, it might be considered that it is.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, onto that, you know, because this is something that Dan and I have talked about a lot. That's the official APCs that those particular journals, you know, are charging now. But it was possible to pay an APC and get an article published open access before there was an officially posted APC number for those titles. And so I think that the announced numbers were affected by what they had been able to collect before it was actually the official APC. So that's probably more of an indication. And in many cases, when we look at the data over subscription content and particularly journals that are identified as non-OA and not having an option, it is still possible in nearly all cases if you have the funding and you do want to make something open. You know, there's a few, you know, outliers that say absolutely no.
And sometimes publishers just offer. I mean, I remember in the mid noughties, that was sort of my previous stint of looking into this, and there were very few hybrid journals, and yet a lot of journals would allow that option, because when you came to submit, if you were funded by particular funders such as Wellcome, who insisted on it, then a thing would light up on your submission form as an author, allowing you to go down the open access route. But it was just something that was only available to authors that were covered by those relevant funders. Some publishers still maintain that policy today. Heather, you're absolutely right. And then what we found, I think around 2014, 2015, was there was a huge move to sort of basically making all this official, and you suddenly saw a huge leap in the numbers of hybrid journals exactly to that point. But yeah, there's
we have another question coming up. Interesting relationship between APCs and then the page charges and color charges that publishers have been known to charge in the past or still currently. Those publishers that may be removing those page and color charges, have we seen an impact on APCs in relation to removal of those charges?
I'll go first, and Heather, I don't know if you've seen anything. Short answers from a data perspective, genuinely don't know, because we don't track both, so we can't really say if there's a relationship between the two.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I would tend to think that it's not happening that commonly. You know, when I think about the workflow of processing, the two, in some instances, might have been the invoice together. So that would have been, you know, harder to maybe tease out. But with journal policy collected, you know, across on community sites and things like that, I'd be interested to see, you know, to the degree to the trend is that those paid charges are being removed, and look at that and what that means, you know, for authors and you know, kind of along the lines of the, you know, airlines charging for checked bags and extra legroom and things like that, and try to see, you know, what that says overall about the state of the market, completely, you know, as a separate issue from APCs.
Yeah, and there's been another project that Heather and I were working on, and I know that it's come up where there could be authors that are not fully aware that when they pay the page charges, when they pay the APCs, they may still owe page charges and color charges for those publishers who haven't removed that too. So it's a good question, worth exploring. So another question for you both. We've been talking across the board and by years and higher impact journals and so on. What about by discipline? Are we seeing anything in particular worth noting or talking about within different disciplines here?
Again, short answer is ish. So there is slight variation depending on the discipline. However, it's worth noting the strongest predictor of how much you're going to pay is whether it's hybrid or fully open access. That swab, that's the big move in the needle, as it were. And then the needle moves a little bit depending on discipline. The shorter answer is that so what we found, this has changed slightly over the years. So this year, I'm just reading out from my notes, just give you a look up screen. So arts and humanities tend to come in slightly, they're the lowest end, social sciences as well. And then physical sciences tend to come in slightly lower than the average. At the higher end, you'll find life sciences and health sciences may be charged slightly higher than average prices, and together those balance each other out. We found that the differences between disciplines are less pronounced for hybrid than they are for fully open. You'll find a slightly bigger difference, I think, with fully open journals. And then on the whole, fully open multidisciplinary journals, they tend to be cheaper than average. So think of the kind of plus ones, the scientific plus one and scientific reports. They will tend to charge slightly cheaper as a general rule, but the higher than average or hybrid APCs, I think they've been driven up slightly by the broad multidisciplinary high impact journals. So the kind of Natures and Cells, they would sort of fall in a multidisciplinary category in the way we categorize things, and they're of course coming in kind of way above the average. So a mix there. Arts and humanities, social sciences, physical sciences slightly lower, life sciences, health slightly higher, and then multidisciplinary, your mileage varies depending whether it's fully open or hybrid.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to bear in mind, with that, arts and humanities is there are so many fewer open access alternative journal options for that subject area, that a small change in a few of them, can affect the numbers there if you're just looking at it by discipline. So you need to keep that in mind as well.
And then probably not something that we can show on the fly right now, but do you want to talk at all about mean and median APCs and what we might have available in the tool?
Yeah, so the short answer, so we do have a chart showing mean and median APCs by open access type and publisher, absolutely. And the tool allows an awful lot of detail into that. So you can look at both medians and means, and that will give you a sense of how skewed the data is. We can break that down across all sorts of dimensions. So we can break those averages down per publisher, by open access type, so actually by both, so you can see publishers' average fully open prices or median open access prices and so on. We can also break those down by major subject disciplines, so what I was just speaking to now, that comes out of that. And then we can also track how those median and averages are changing over time as well. Again, broken down by subject area and publisher, so you can sort of see how the prices are shifting. One thing I didn't say right at the start, but just since it was asked, so if you look at this year's prices for fully open access journals, the average was $1875 US, whereas the median was $1800. And then for hybrids, the mean is just over $3,205, with the median at $3,085. So yeah, we track that data, and there's some headline averages for you there as well. Also, there's no slides on at the moment, just in case people are wondering why the screen's gone black, because we have one slide left, which is our finishing slide. So I was trying not to distract everyone with that one chart as the conversation had moved on.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. And then another question here, and we might be getting to the end of our questions as we come up on the hour. As OA becomes more established, when you compare two titles where the only difference is the business model, so the scope, the impact factor, audience fit is very similar, it seems it would be harder to justify the price difference between hybrid and OA. And so are we seeing that gap closing slightly already? And how long do you think it'll be before that gap closes? Do you envision it happening more so with fully gold OA journal APCs increasing, or by hybrids decreasing, or both?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it does speak to the, I suppose, slightly unusual nature of our market, because I think the APC market is not, it's not like a consumer market where people really will shop around based on price. There are many other factors, I think, that influence an author's choice of venue to which to submit. So, I mean, yes, all things being equal, it would seem harder to justify the price difference. And in fact, you might argue that counterintuitively, if for fully open journals, the only source of their revenue is APCs, that they've got to cover everything. Whereas, of course, for hybrids, hybrid journals have got the open access bit, but they've all got some subscription revenue coming in as well. So you could almost argue the prices should go the other way around. We don't take any sides on this. We can only, of course, report on the observed data. So I think that there is a gap. I think it's closing slightly. As to how long it will take, well, of course, if I knew that, I frankly wouldn't be sitting here. I'd have bought my winning lottery numbers. So, as I always say to people, that's one of those hard ones to guess. I think it will over time, but we do have quite a small C conservative market. As I said, there are other factors. So I think publishers tend to be cautious. And what we've seen looking at the data over the years is that things tend to move pretty slowly. And then finally, as to whether one will go up or the other will go down, well, when it comes to prices, I'm fairly certain on this one. I think the fully open is likely to go up rather than the hybrid coming down. But again, all predictions can be proven wrong in the fullness of time. Heather, interested in your take, and Laurie on that. Where do you think we'll end up?
Yeah, I mean, no one journal can be compared precisely. So you can put in certain criteria, but I think that it's going to be interesting moving forward when we get into an era that perhaps has more transparency around APCs, that publishers will argue what their differentiators are. Maybe that's speed to publication. Yeah. Maybe that is the type of peer review. Maybe it's just additional types of author marketing and the things that they do. So that would just become another reason to either justify bumping up your APC a little bit and explaining why, or perhaps benefiting from economies of scale on one of those things or another, and being able to say, hey, we can lower that accordingly. So it's going to be an interesting space to watch.
Yeah, definitely.
Probably one other thing to throw in, as I think of it, is just the role of diamond / platinum. So the sponsored journal models tend to be more prevalent amongst fully open journals, and of course that might be leading to lower average prices as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have just about 10 minutes left and 2 more questions, I would say. So just really quickly building on the previous question, with the growing number of transformative agreements, and so journals beginning to flip from hybrid to OA over the next few years based on those agreements, to what extent do you think this will affect that gap between the fully open and the hybrid APCs?
Again, very good question. This is my gut speaking. I wonder if it would start to narrow the gap, because essentially what we're now doing is just bringing everything together. And we may find the notion of an APC starts to become less common in years' time as people go back to what are essentially very large subscription deals, except you're now subscribing to publish rather than subscribing to read, which is sort of ultimately where these things could land up. But again, I know, Heather.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend on how the agreements are structured. If it is, a token-based agreement, for example, then the APC that the researcher effectively pays, it may not be a difference between one and the other. It may be something that becomes more just more straightforward for institutions that have deals, and then the institutions that don't have deals could see interesting things happen. It's definitely something we're looking at, and we are going to be revisiting some analysis that Dan did last year around transformative journals to see, how the historical data and last year's data, continues to align with the different criteria. But again, I probably say it too much, but another interesting space to watch.
Yeah. All right. One final question before we wrap up. What does this all mean for libraries? I don't know who wants to go first.
I mean, I'm happy to kind of jump in there, and we have been thinking a lot. We have a lot of libraries that do utilize the OA-DAT, and libraries are as interested in data, certainly as publishers are, maybe more so if they're going into conversations with a publisher. They want to go in knowing where their researchers are publishing and what those APCs are. So we're in the process. We did a webinar earlier this month that is now up in a recording of looking at, how we can help libraries, to get that data. But I think, there are interesting developments, like the Neural Elsevier agreement, which was largely looking kind of beyond APC negotiations, but for institutions or consortia that maybe don't have quite the leverage that a Neural would have. I think trying to look at APC data is going to be something that continues to be important for the coming years. So Dan, do you want to add to that, or?
No, I think that you covered it.
All right, great. Well, that is a wrap for our session today. Many thanks, Heather and Dan, and all of you for participating today. We appreciate you spending this time with us. And we'll share a recorded version of this session on our website in a few days. If you're here today, you'll receive a notification when it's available in case you want to listen again or share it with colleagues. If anything more occurs to you and you'd like to discuss anything with us, or you're interested in some additional information, please feel free to email us. Heather and Dan's email are up on the screen. And Dan and I will be at the London Book Fair, woohoo, travel, next week. Kind of excited to be traveling a bit, cautiously excited. So if any of you are planning to attend, please stop by our stand. We're in the Alps Pavilion, and say hello. And lastly, we will have another News and Views webinar coming up in a few months. So watch out for notice of our next session, and stay healthy and well, everyone. Take care, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.